Good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many people joining us tonight. I am Rabbi Kara Weinstein Rosenthal, and I'm so glad that you're joining us for tonight's program, Socially Just, Unapologetically Zionist, with our guest presenter, Amanda Berman from Zioness. We live in a time of discord and division, a time in which people seem to feel the need to highlight what separates us rather than what unites us. Our society is quick to divide people into in versus out, us versus them. Our society is all too quick to label someone the other. And of course, in a divisive society, who usually gets identified as the other? The Jews. In 2021, we are all too aware of the threat of anti-Semitism coming at us from all sides. In terms of anti-Semitism on the political right in the United States, what do I really need to say about that except to remind you of the Nazi propaganda present at the Capitol insurrection just a few weeks ago? We saw terrible images of people wearing shirts that said things like Camp Auschwitz and 6 million wasn't enough. And I think it is our responsibility to acknowledge that anti-Semitism exists on the left as well, particularly in the form of anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiment. When we Jews assert that we oppose racism and sexism and homophobia, as we should, as our religion tells us we must, there are those who are quick to tell us that we don't have the right to express those ideas if we also support Israel, that we can't be part of these important conversations happening in our country around issues of racial and social justice if we assert pride in being Jewish and advocate for Israel's right to defend herself. So people are trying to tell us what we can be and what we should believe. And we as Jews are left wondering, how can we make the world understand that no one has the right to tell us where we do and don't belong, and to dictate to us which parts of our identities are allowed to coexist? Amanda Berman has emerged as a leading voice in the Jewish community to help Jews address these issues and to empower us to speak up for ourselves and for Israel, even as we advocate for a more just society for all. Amanda Berman is the founder and executive director of the Zioness movement, a new initiative empowering and activating Zionists on the progressive left to stand proudly in social justice spaces as Jews and Zionists. Until she recently made the transition to focusing exclusively on building the much needed Zionist community, Amanda was also a civil rights attorney fighting anti-Semitism legally, spearheading such groundbreaking initiatives as the International Action Against Kuwait Airways for its discrimination against Israeli nationals, and the dual cases against San Francisco State University for its constitutional and civil rights violations against Jewish and Israeli students and community members. Amanda writes on Jewish and civil rights issues and is a media contributor across various mediums and outlets. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in Diplomatic History and a Master of Governmental Administration, and received her Juris Doctor from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. Amanda practiced securities litigation at Cahill, Gordon, and Reindel before dedicating her career to the advancement and protection of the Jewish people and the Zionist community. We're honored to have Amanda Berman here with us tonight as our guest presenter and to have this opportunity to learn from her and her experience as we consider the ways in which the Jewish community can remain strong and can continue to be a force for good within American society. Before I turn things over to Amanda in just a second, I'm just going to give you a couple of comments on the background of this program and on housekeeping for tonight. First of all, we are so honored and grateful to have a big crowd with us tonight. The upside is that we have a great crowd tonight. The downside is that that has the possibility to lead to background noise on Zoom. So we are keeping everybody muted for the duration of the program. However, our chat box function is open. Feel free to type questions for Amanda into the chat box, and then after she gives her presentation, we'll have time to take questions in that way. So people are encouraged to participate via the chat box and ask questions. I also want to just note with immense gratitude that our presentation and our program this evening is sponsored by the Zelman Next Generation Engagement Fund and by the Arthur Goldberg Social Action and Cultural Arts Fund. And we're so grateful to those sources of funding for making this program possible. And I also want to give a word of thanks to our Social Action Committee for helping to bring this program to fruition, and especially to our committee chair, Wendy Yeager-Hyman, who has put her tireless work and leadership behind this program, as with all of our social action programs. And with that, I will turn the spotlight over to Amanda Berman.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for that beautiful introduction and for the context. And thank you also, Wendy. I know you've been working hard to put this together for a long time, and I'm thrilled that it worked out. And thank you all so much for joining. I know we get a little zoomed out these days, so it's really great to have this audience. And I hope you feel inspired and ready to take action as a Zioness. And to reiterate what the Rabbi said, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. Please feel free in the chat. I'm going to give you some background and tell you about Zioness, what it is, why it exists, and what we do. And from there, would love to engage. I think it's always, I know people have a lot of thoughts on these kinds of issues. So, it's always an interesting, I think, addition to a program to engage your questions and comments. So, Zioness, I wish I could see all of you. Usually I would ask how many of you have heard of Zioness before, and usually it's about half of any given audience. But Zioness is a domestic social justice activist organization that is committed to the advancement of the progressive agenda in America. And I know that progressive is a buzzword that makes people automatically uncomfortable. I'm going to come back to that. Just hold your thoughts on that. We are committed to the advancement of social, racial, economic, environmental, and gender justice in this country. We are predominantly Jews. There are also many allies of the Jewish community involved in Zioness. And the reason that we exist is because so many American Jews who are committed Zionists, knowing that Zionism is nothing more than the Jewish movement for liberation and self-determination, and also nothing less, we want to remain committed to that notion that the Jewish people, not just the Jews as a religious group, but the Jews as a people, as a nation, are entitled to sovereignty and independence in our indigenous homeland. And we hold that as a progressive value. The Jewish people are one of the world's most enduring persecuted communities, and Zionism is our progressive movement of liberation and self-determination. It's something that we as a people should be so proud of. And in a lot of progressive spaces, unfortunately, in America, we're told that Zionism is incompatible with our other progressive commitments. And as the Rabbi mentioned, when we show up to fight for women's rights and reproductive health and freedom, we're told that Zionism is somehow incompatible with that. When we show up to fight for LGBTQ equality, and we talk about how important it is to make sure that our LGBTQ siblings know that they are entitled to the same rights and freedoms in America as anyone else, we're told that our Zionism is incompatible with that. And people talk to us about pinkwashing, which is itself an anti-Semitic term. And this goes on and on. In the racial justice movement, there are people who really believe and perpetuate the notion that because of police and law enforcement training exchanges between the US and Israel, that American Jews are actually responsible for the death of young Black people at the hands of the police in America. And so Jews who are so deeply committed to racial justice, who have been part of the racial justice movement and really at the forefront of all progressive movements in this country and around the world, in fact, those of us who remain committed and want to be part of these movements of justice and equity and equality in America are told somehow that as Jews, we're not welcome unless we abandon our own community, unless we abandon Zionism and the Jewish movement for liberation. And we're told that Zionism is oppression and apartheid and genocide and colonialism and imperialism, when in fact Zionism is none of those things. Zionism is a miracle. Zionism is freedom for a persecuted minority that has faced every kind of oppression in every society in the history of the world. It is the embodiment of progressive values that the Jewish people should see our security, our independence come to fruition. Now, the contemporary manifestation of the Zionist dream in the state of Israel is not perfect, right? There's always more work to do. But our right to have a state of our own in our indigenous homeland, in our ancestral homeland, that is an inalienable right of all people, but it's something that only the Jews are told that we're not entitled to. So to tell you a little bit about me, and I'll bring it back to where Zionist came from, I grew up outside Philadelphia in a typical American Jewish home. We were Zionists not because we knew anything about Israel or Israeli politics, or because we debated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the dinner table. We were Zionists because we were Jews and because Jews believe in Jewish civil rights. And I often say that the day I was born, my grandparents bought Israel bonds for my college fund, and I'm sure that there are many people on this Zoom that, that resonates with, or that have done the same thing. And so I was a Zionist from literally the day I was born. I was invested in the future of the state of Israel. And that was never in any way presented as incompatible with my domestic progressive commitments. I grew up in a very feminist family, very progressive family. We always talked about politics and policies and, how we could make America better. And I was always involved in progressive movements, liberal movements, politics. My mom ran for office. My family was always engaged in these conversations. And when I went to college, I continued to be involved in every organization. I went to graduate school for public policy. I went to law school and worked at the Beth Tzedek Legal Services Clinic and in the Holocaust and Refugees Clinic, and always was working to advance other persecuted communities. It wasn't really until after college and after I spent extensive time in Israel that I started to realize that people were telling me I had to choose, that I had to make this false choice between being a progressive and being a Zionist. And I immediately recognized anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism because it was targeting me as a Jew who believes that Israel should exist, that wasn't talking about the politics and policies of the Israeli government, but just as a Jew who believes that Israel should exist, that Zionism is totally compatible with all of my other progressive commitments. I was told, no, it's not. And you have to choose. If you want to be a Jew involved in our domestic, progressive, grassroots movements, you have to check a piece of your identity at the door. And I didn't want to do that. And I looked around and I didn't really see anyone else having this experience. My friends that I went to school with that held all the same values that I did, when I talked about it, frankly, they thought that I was a conspiracy theorist. And everybody said, you see anti-Semitism everywhere. But it became more and more obvious to people over time. And if you think about a variety of different social justice movements that really came to the fore in 2016, during the, really in 2015, during the election process, there was the Black Lives Matter manifesto. It was the Movement for Black Lives, which is the umbrella under which Black Lives Matter operates. And the manifesto, again, as I mentioned, claimed that American Jews were responsible for the death of young Black people in America by police because of counter-terror training between American law enforcement and Israeli law enforcement. And the manifesto called Israel an apartheid state and accused it of committing genocide against the Palestinians. And I really felt that it was a test. Was I going to show up and commit to the racial justice movement in America, even while the movement was abandoning me and my people and telling us that we don't have a right to participate unless we abandon ourselves? And I really didn't know what to do. And a couple months later, where there were protests around Standing Rock. And I don't know if people are familiar with what happened at Standing Rock, but during the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was being constructed from Canada through the center of the United States. And it was being built, the pipeline, which is now not being built anymore, but the pipeline was being built through Sioux territory, the indigenous people, the Sioux tribe. And there were massive protests on the land at Standing Rock. And everyone there was waving Palestinian flags. And there was a big sign to enter the protest. There was a huge Palestinian flag. And so all the people, including the vice chair of the Zioness board who showed up to protest at Standing Rock, were basically told, if you want to be part of this coalition, you have to be anti-Zionist. And the reason for the Palestinian flag was to say, this is the indigenous Sioux tribe. We want to stand up and protect the indigenous people of Standing Rock. And if you care about the indigenous people of Standing Rock, you have to care about the indigenous people of Palestine, which, according to all of these protesters who brought the Palestinian flags, was not the Jews, even though we know that the Jewish people are indigenous to that land, to the land of Israel. Then there was the Women's March. And I am sure a lot of you have heard about the anti-Semitism in the leadership of the Women's March. And that was devastating. I mean, this was just a couple months later that the Women's March happened and the leadership said, Zionists are not welcome. I mean, literally, Zionists are not welcome to show up at the Women's March. And again, when I talked to people about this and they said, Amanda, are you going to the Women's March? You've always been, showing up at every women's movement thing, at every reproductive justice and health event. How can it be that you're not going to the Women's March? I said, I really feel like I can't go because the leadership tells me that I'm not allowed to be a Zionist. And that is a direct attack on my actual identity. So, people thought I was crazy and everybody went to the Women's March and I didn't go. And I could list so many more events. This was all in the course of just 6 months. I could list so many more events for you, but let's just skip ahead to June of 2017, which is when 3 Jewish lesbians were marching in the Chicago Dyke March, which is it's sort of the radical event of Pride weekend in Chicago. And they were kicked out because they were carrying a pride flag with a Jewish star. And many of you may have heard the story. They were told that the Jewish star in the center of the pride flag was too reminiscent of the Israeli flag, and it was triggering people and making them feel unsafe. Now, there was nothing about that Jewish star other than the fact that it was in the center of the flag that had anything to do with the Israeli flag. And it was Jewish LGBT people who wanted to show up with their full authentic selves at an event that is supposed to represent them and fight for their equality in America. And they were told, your Jewish star makes us feel unsafe and you're not welcome to be here with that Jewish star. Now, that was the first time that people started really paying attention to the anti-Semitism that was existing in the progressive space. And for sure, it's different than the anti-Semitism we see that comes, from the political right, the neo-Nazi type, the white supremacist type. We recognize that immediately. The Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt is the easiest way to see anti-Semitism. You don't have to think twice about that. But the anti-Semitism that exists in the left is different. It's not going to show up with machine guns, and it's not going to show up with skinheads, but it's going to show up in a way that makes Jews feel like we have to cleanse ourselves of our identities. Like we have to abandon a piece of ourselves and our people and our history and our story and our commitment to our own liberation in order to show up for others. And what happens, and I'm sure that all of you have, students in your family, Jewish students in your family who have experienced this, what happens is that impressionable, progressive, good-hearted Jews, when they face this choice between being part of our community, being proud of their Zionism and their commitment to the Jewish people, the future and continuity of the Jewish people, when they face the choice between being that or showing up as allies for other marginalized communities in America, they say, I'm not really that worried about the Jews, right? The Jews feel pretty safe. The Jews feel like things are okay. And, maybe there's some anti-Semitism, but Israel's strong. It doesn't need me to fight for it. And they don't realize actually that a world without Israel is a world in which the Jewish people are not safe. And my generation of Jews can't imagine the possibility of a world without a strong Israel. We've never lived or existed in a time in which Israel hasn't been strong and really appreciated. We don't really understand Jewish vulnerability because we haven't really experienced it. And we do see the vulnerability of other marginalized communities in America, and we want to show up for them. And so when people are faced with this choice, with this binary, you can be for yourself or you can be for others. And that may remind you of a pretty famous quote. They say, okay, I don't want to be selfish. I don't want to fight for myself. I want to fight for others. And what Zioness says is you have to fight for yourself and for others at the same time. We can't abandon our own community in the fight for social justice at home because that fight has to include us. And honestly, the neo-Nazi threat that we saw at the Capitol, the white supremacist threat in this country, requires that the Jewish people be in coalition with other communities of color. Because really what a lot of people don't understand is that white supremacists see the Jews as the invisible hand that is working to advance communities of color and immigrants and refugees in this country to destroy white America. And the best example of this, the best way for me to illustrate this for you is that when neo-Nazis were marching in Charlottesville in August of 2017, they were saying, Jews will not replace us, right? Everyone remembers, Jews will not replace us. They don't mean that Jews in America, who make up less than 2% of the population of this country, they don't mean that we are going to procreate at such rates that we are going to overtake white Christian patriarchy. That's not what they mean. What they mean is Jews will not replace us by using their omnipotent power to bring people of color and immigrants and refugees to the forefront of American society and to wash us out, to wash out white power. That's what they mean. And so while the right hates the Jews because they see us as committed to the advancement of other marginalized communities, which actually is true, but that's a threat to their view of white nationalism, in a lot of spaces in the left, the Jews are accused of being privileged and powerful white people who are actually oppressing communities of color. So what ends up happening is that the Jews get cleaved from both sides of the political spectrum. We don't really have anywhere to go. And anyone who has studied history for 5 minutes knows that it's not a good situation when the Jews don't have political representation. So I'm going to go back to, I mentioned the Chicago Dyke March and the 3 lesbians who were kicked out for carrying a pride flag with a Jewish star. That was in June of 2017. And 2 months after that, in August of 2017, there was another event called the Chicago Slut Walk. I'm going to explain it. I know it's sort of a provocative name for an event, but the Slut Walk launched in Toronto about 10, 15 years ago. It was after a rape trial where the woman, the victim, was put on the stand and she was asked, what were you wearing and had you been drinking and why were you in that place at that time? So for the women in the audience, you recognize that, and some of the men, I'm sure, you recognize that as classic victim blaming. Suggestions that the woman wasn't appropriately dressed or that she shouldn't have been, walking alone at night, or that maybe she had been drinking, and therefore that maybe she deserved to be sexually assaulted. And the accused was acquitted. Now, this is a very regular occurrence, but for some reason, this trial really lit a spark for people. And there was an event that was commemorating this trial, and it was called the Slut Walk. And it really caught fire, and now there are slut walks all over the world. There's one in Tel Aviv. I mean, they're big events. There's one in Los Angeles that's pretty famous. And what happens at the Slut Walk is that people show up really not wearing very much. And the message of the event is, it doesn't matter what I was wearing. It doesn't matter if I had been drinking. You don't get to touch me without my permission. It is a very empowering feminist event. It talks about LGBTQ issues. It is really a repudiation of patriarchy and of victim blaming, slut shaming is the term, and sexual assault and abuse. And this is something that I care a lot about as a young American woman. So when the Slut Walk in Chicago in August of 2017 announced, We endorsed the policy of the Dyke March, which had kicked out the 3 lesbians, again with the pride flag with the Jewish stars just 2 months before. We endorsed that policy, and Jewish stars will be banned from the slut walk as Zionist symbols of racism and oppression. They announced this very publicly. And I was talking to friends and I just said, I can't let that happen. I wear a Jewish star every day. They're telling me that I'm not allowed to participate in this event that is about women's bodily integrity and autonomy, about reproductive freedom, about sexual assault and abuse. I'm not allowed to go to that event with my Jewish star necklace. I can't allow this to be the situation in the progressive movements that are my organic ideological home and are the organic ideological home of so many American Jews. I just can't let them tell me that as a Zionist, I'm not welcome. And you watch what happens, that first it starts by calling you a Zionist and saying the Jewish star on your flag reminds people of the Israeli flag, but then it's just as a Jew, you can't wear your Jewish star anywhere. So, I was talking to some friends and we said, we're gonna go to Chicago and we have to march in the slut walk and we have to wear our Jewish stars. And we have to show up proudly as Zionists because we need to reclaim our identity. We can't allow people to pervert this term that is so intrinsic to Jewish identity. And there are people out there who say Zionism has nothing to do with the Jewish people. But I say Zionism is not just the modern political movement to recreate a Jewish sovereign polity in the land of Israel. Zionism is central to Jewish identity because we are the people of Zion. We are the children of Zion from Mount Zion. Every synagogue in the world faces Jerusalem. We are from Jerusalem. We are indigenous to Jerusalem. And when we pray, we say next year in Jerusalem. You can't open a prayer book at a synagogue without finding Israel, the children of Israel, Zion on every page. So for people who say, I'm going to attack you as a Zionist, I'm going to talk about Zionism as colonialism and white supremacy, they don't understand Jewish history. They don't understand the Jewish story. They don't understand our commitment to Zion. The fact that that everything we do as a people relates our cultures, our traditions. It's so much more than our religious practices, that we are united, and that for thousands of years in the diaspora, the Jews exiled from the land of Israel were united in our everlasting longing for Zion. So I refuse to let people attack me as a Zionist. I am so proud of what Zionism is, of what the Jewish people have overcome for thousands of years. Zionism is not just intrinsic to my Jewish identity, it is really the animating force of my Jewish identity. I'm not a religious Jew. I don't really, observe religion, but I am so proud of what our people have accomplished in this world. And I am so proud of what Zionism means for other persecuted communities, because as a people, we have learned what it means to fight for equality and for justice. And those are lessons that we can apply to fight for other marginalized people too. Now, I don't want to make this political. I know that, people have all different political opinions, but what I want to say is that for Jews who identify with the political left, and this is not about political parties, it's about grassroots activism, social justice, caring about your neighbor, caring about others, tikkun olam. For those people who want to be engaged in the progressive movements that matter, who want to fight for all people in this country, for equity, for really the dream of America, the promise of America. If you want to be part of those fights and you feel like you've shown up and you've been told Zionists are not welcome here, you're not alone. And I know that the first time you hear that, it's so shocking. And for all of you who maybe have kids or grandkids who have had that experience, it's really shocking. But the way to overcome that is not to cede our progressive movements to bigotry. It's also not to point somewhere else, for people on the left who point at the right and say, all the anti-Semitism is there. And people on the right who point at the left and say, all the anti-Semitism is there. Well, then we're all just weaponizing anti-Semitism for political gain instead of fighting it. We have to fight anti-Semitism in the spaces where we belong, where we exist, where we speak the language, where we are united and committed to the same values. And that's really hard, right? It's really hard because you want your space to be stronger. And it's always easier to point at someone else than it is to do some internal reflection. But our justice movements need a little bit of internal reflection. And so what Zioness is about is saying we care so much about the advancement of these movements that we are committed to rooting out all forms of bigotry that exist within them. And there's no doubt that even within the most progressive spaces, there is still sexism and misogyny. There is still racism and homophobia. There is still rampant anti-Semitism. And our movements for justice will not succeed unless we are pushing out all those forms of bigotry and uniting. And so that's what Zioness is about. It's about being part of our coalitions for justice, being proud Zionists, refusing to let anyone pervert the term Zionism or tell us that it means something other than what we define it to be. You know, we ask, and we want to understand racism, as so many of us did this summer. We take the lead of Black leaders. We listen to them. We hear about their lived experiences. When we want to hear about homophobia, we ask our LGBTQ siblings to talk to us and explain to us how we can be part of the fight against homophobia. When we talk to immigrants and refugees about their experiences and what xenophobia feels like in America, we listen to them. We let them define it. But somehow the Jewish people are the only persecuted community who are told anti-Zionism is an anti-Semitism. We don't want to listen to you define your own oppression. We're going to tell you what your oppression is. Well, that's wrong. And the only way that we can make sure people know it's wrong is by showing up and having the hard conversations in the spaces, again, where we operate, where we're comfortable, where we have relationships. So are there questions? I don't see any questions. I mean, I can always keep talking.
I don't see any questions yet, but I do want to just encourage everybody again to please, I think everybody should be able to use the chat function, and I just want to encourage everybody to type some questions into the chat box. If I can ask a question, actually, Amanda, to start us off, I'm wondering if you could, you used a very interesting term early on in your talk, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with it, and I'd love for you to just say a little bit more about it. It's pinkwashing, because I think that's a very interesting thing that happens.
Yeah, sure. So pinkwashing is a term that people use when they want to really marginalize Jews who love Israel. And there's been a lot of conversation among the Jewish community about how proud we are of Israel's support for LGBTQ equality. And of course, Israel is the only country in the Middle East where LGBTQ equality is real, and you know, where LGBTQ people, frankly, aren't grossly persecuted, violently persecuted because of their sexual orientation. And basically, the response from people who claim to be activists for Palestinian rights, and I'm going to come back to that term, activists for Palestinian rights, but they attack Jews who love Israel and say, you're pinkwashing. You're trying to cover up for Israel's oppressive behavior, Israel's wrongdoing toward the Palestinians by citing Israel's support for LGBTQ people. And it's sort of a crazy story about how this term came to be. It's a long story, so I'm not going to go into it, but it's really mind-boggling, because it actually is the people who claim that Israelis and people who support Israel are pinkwashing by bringing up the fact that in Israel, LGBTQ people are protected. They are actually pinkwashing because they refuse to actually talk about LGBTQ rights in other places in the Middle East, including in the Palestinian territories. It's really the definition of gaslighting. For people who know what gaslighting means, it's making people feel crazy for believing something. Like, you know, if you say, but Israel's good for LGBTQ people, and they're like, but you're pinkwashing, you're just using that as an example to cover up Israel's crimes. And, you know, I said I would come back to the idea that people who say that, they claim to be advocates for Palestinian equality. And the problem is, in attacking Israel, they're not doing anything constructive for the Palestinians. And those of us who want peace, who want two states, who want to see the humanity of everyone in the region respected, we can't just attack the other side. we can't just point fingers. It goes to the same thing as fighting anti-Semitism here at home. You can't just point somewhere else and say it's all their fault. We all have to do a little bit of internal reflection. And I think it's really important. And, I'll say I hate the term pro-Israel, which is a challenging thing to say to some audiences, but we set up these binaries in these conversations where if you say you're pro-Israel, someone else hears that you're anti-Palestinian, even though that's not what you said. That's how they hear it. Because we set up pro versus anti. And that's really damaging because I am both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. I'm pro-humanity. I'm pro-coexistence. And I believe that Zionism is a critical movement for the Jewish people and that it is totally consistent with Palestinian self-determination as well. And any other formulation of that is intended to put one of those people in a place of systemic powerlessness. And that is an unacceptable reality. The other binary that's created by the term pro-Israel is that if we call ourselves the pro-Israel community, those of us who love Israel call ourselves the pro-Israel community, then we're legitimizing the anti-Israel community. We're legitimizing the notion that there are people in the world who think that one state, only one state out of 193 states in the world, member states of the United Nations, one of them is illegitimate. And we should destroy it. We are anti-Israel. Well, that's not a legitimate position. No one's anti-Syria or anti-Russia or anti-China, or anti any other government in the world, anti-France. Have you ever heard of the anti-France movement? It's not a legitimate position. So I want us to move away from binaries, to reclaim our identity as Zionists and to make people understand that Zionists hold all the same values that they do. The Jews are Zionists who care about justice for all people. And that's how you address this idea that if you love Israel and you talk about, Israel's commitment to equality for LGBTQ people, somehow that automatically means that you're trying to cover up Israeli wrongdoing. That goes straight to the heart of this binary, that if you love Israel, it means automatically that you're anti-Palestinian. People who say they're fighting for Palestinian rights should be fighting actually for Palestinian infrastructure and education and healthcare, for the advancement of the Palestinian people, not fighting against Israel, not fighting against Jews. That's anti-Semitism.
I think that that was a great answer, and it sort of leads into one of the other questions that we had that's been coming in. We have a question from Allison White. How do you suggest raising issues of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism and not taking away from the centering of other marginalized groups?
This is such an important question and a really important thing for everyone to be thinking about, whether you're engaging as Zionist or not. We don't bring up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I understand it's sort of I understand why people automatically think your organization is called Zioness. You must be constantly talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we don't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all. We talk about Zionism as a progressive movement and very consistent with our domestic progressive values. And, it comes up to the extent that we're wearing shirts or we're carrying posters or whatever it is. And we talk, of course, about how committed we are to Zionism. But when we go to an event like the Chicago Slut Walk, well, actually, I'll come back to that. There's a different question about what happened there. And I'm excited to tell you all the story of what happened there. When we go to an event like a Black Lives Matter march or rally, and we're there because we care about racial justice in America, and we're showing up as Zioness, it's not to take away from what that event is about. We will not engage in conversations that take away from what that event is about. But if somebody says, oh, you're a Zionist, why are you a Zionist, or what are you doing here? Zionists are not welcome here. We train our activists and our chapters to know how to respond to that, to say, that's an attack on me as a Jew. And I'm here because I care about advancing the racial justice movement. And I want to be part of this movement because, I'm an American. I vote in America. I care about equity in this country. I care about, making sure that our institutions can overcome our history of systemic racism. Those are but also I'm a Zionist because I believe in fighting for my own community as well. And people really have not had a nuanced conversation with a Zionist before. They're associating Zionism with apartheid and genocide and colonialism and racism because that's what they're hearing in the progressive space. They're not hearing from people like all of us. And so that's why it's so important to participate in these movements, not to cede them to bigotry, not to stay home and hope the tide turns. We have to be active in these movements. And we can't point back to Rabbi Heschel marching with Martin Luther King in the 60s. That was 60 years ago. So for all of us who care about these issues, we have to show up and be part of them. And we have to make sure that, we are being good allies. And again, and it's a really good question, not taking away, not trying to center ourselves, but being fully authentic in our activism and making sure that people recognize that Zionism is totally consistent with our commitment to all these other values. So should I answer the question about what happened when we showed up in Chicago with the Jewish stars?
Please do, because I wanted to know that too.
Yeah. It's a great story. So we went, obviously. I was talking to, this is how the name Zioness came to be, was that we said, okay, we're going to go to Chicago and we're going to go to this event. I was talking to a friend who does PR, public relations, and he said, well, you need a logo and you need a name and you need t-shirts and posters and a Facebook page, and you're going to invite people and we're going to put out a press release. And I was a practicing attorney at the time, and it was like in 3 days, I had no idea how we were going to make this happen, but we did. And it was covered in the Jewish press that this new group, Zioness, was going to the Chicago Slut Walk. And the Slut Walk actually announced on social media, it was on a Saturday, and they announced on Friday on Twitter that they had not invited us, that we weren't welcome, that Zionism was white supremacy, and that we weren't allowed to participate. Of course, we went anyway, and we had about 40 people. And the whole event was only about 150 people. It's a pretty radical event. So we had a really large contingent of people who were there, and it was a very diverse group of activists at the Slut Walk. And we had our t-shirts. I mean, it was August, so it was very warm. We had our posters, and they had changed the whole lineup of speakers at the Slut Walk to talk exclusively about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it was not about women's rights or reproductive health or victim blaming or slut shaming or patriarchy or any of the issues that the Slut Walk is supposed to be about. They had, people talking about Israeli oppression of Palestinians and violation of Palestinian women's rights. I mean, it was really, mind-blowingly just not what the event was supposed to be about. But we went and we were listening, trying to be respectful. And of course, we wanted to talk about the domestic issues that the event was supposed to be about. But the organizers of the march actually brought red umbrellas, which are the symbol of the international sex trade. And they were chasing us around this public park with the umbrellas, hitting our posters, our Zionist posters. I mean, it was assault. And they would open the umbrellas to cover the posters when the media was taking pictures of the crowd, because they had said Jewish stars are banned. And as you can see in the logo, in the corners of my screen, our logo is people with a Jewish star. So they covered the Jewish star with the umbrella so that there would be no pictures of a Jewish star in the media coverage of the event. So, they were making such a scene. There were all these people, speaking on the stage, and the organizers of the event were making such a scene, chasing us around this park and hitting our posters and, blocking us. And it was really, it was so obnoxious what they were doing that a lot of the other activists who were there for the right reasons, and it goes to the previous question of how do you make sure that you're not centering yourselves and you're centering the issues. We were so much not centering ourselves, other than the fact that we were showing up fully, in our authentic Jewish Zionist identities, but we were showing up to talk about women's rights. I mean, that was the whole point. And so all these other activists kind of came up to us and said, what is going on here? Why are they chasing you? Why are they literally attacking you? What is their problem with you? You guys seem to be nice people who are here for the right reasons and, who care about the issues that the Slut Walk is intended to address. So what's going on? And we had the opportunity to engage. And the other people who were at this event had either never heard of Zionism before or had only heard horrible things about Zionism, that Zionism was, associated with all of the worst human rights violations in the world. And so for them to meet a Zionist who shared their values, or to see a group of Zionists who shared their values and who said, we want to be here because this is an issue that matters to us as young American women. Like, this is a thing that we really want to be part of. It is a movement for justice that we want to see move forward. And, we really exposed the anti-Semitism of the organizers who were claiming it's anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So why were they attacking the Jews, the people with Jewish stars, at this event? And so we were able to really share our message with people who would have never heard anything positive about a Zionist before, would have never seen themselves, marching arm in arm with a Zionist who cared about the same issues that they did. So that was really sort of the maiden voyage of Zioness. Because there was so much coverage in the Jewish press, we started getting people reaching out from all over the country saying, we really want to be part of this. We want to bring a chapter to our local community. We really want to be, showing up at events with Zioness and really working to move the ball forward on progress in this country. And we want to do it as proud Zionists. So we set up all these chapters all over the country, and it really became a force. Zioness really became the ideological home of people who had been facing this false choice for so long and really felt politically unrepresented and didn't know really where they belonged. So it was sort of amazing. And, we did a lot of work after that on the Women's March and exposing the challenges in the Women's March. Again, not because we wanted to destroy the Women's March, but because we want to protect the integrity of the progressive movement. We really want to bring people together to move the ball forward. And that means that, we have to do the hard work of confronting any forms of hate that exist within the movements.
I really appreciate the way that you articulated all of that. And that's an amazing story with the umbrellas and everything. But I really appreciate the way you articulated, especially that last point about how, our presence is not detracting from domestic progressive movements or agendas. It's adding to them and really keeping them more authentic in some ways. I wanted to bring in another question from the chat box that touches on something that you mentioned a moment ago, which is sort of the tricky relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the distinction between them, if you can even make a distinction between them. And we had a great sort of question/comment in the chat box from Lauren saying, isn't anti-Zionism just a more modern, politically correct form of anti-Semitism? Is there a way to combat that really? People will just make up another reason to blame Jews. I know that sounds jaded, but I feel that people who claim to care about Palestinians are simply jumping on the latest anti-Jew bandwagon. And I wonder, Amanda, if you could sort of address that and maybe sort of tease out, I guess, for us, kind of what we're talking about, maybe making explicit, because I think we've been using these terms throughout the evening, but maybe helping us understand even better what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Zionism as it relates to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is a really important question. And it really is at the crux of what we do, is explaining to people what anti-Zionism, and I always put it in quotes, I can't take it seriously as a term, because yes, I totally agree. It is just a new contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism. One of my favorite people to quote on this is Yossi Klein Halevi, who many of you may know. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He wrote Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. I mean, he is an extraordinary writer and commentator, and happens to be a remarkable mentor to me. And Yossi talked about how, in a speech at I think the University of Chicago, maybe 2 years ago, Yossi talked about how anti-Semitism has manifested differently over time. And so, first it was that the Jews killed Jesus. That was really the first manifestation of anti-Semitism. Well, really, we could go to Pharaoh, being afraid of Jews procreating in such numbers that, and it goes to Jews will not replace us. The same thing in Charlottesville is what Pharaoh thought, I have to make the Jews slaves because they're having children. They're going to, take over Egyptian society. And so we have to watch out for this threat of the Jews. Then of course the Jews killed Jesus, and in medieval times there was the blood libel. Jews are baking the blood of Christian children into their matzah. And over time, it's looked a little bit different in terms of Jews being targeted as a people or as a religion or as an ethnic group or a race. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were of impure blood. They were a threat to whiteness, the same threat that the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville said. So Yossi, went through all of these different ways that anti-Semitism has manifested, the Jews being targeted for a different quality, the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, the Jewish race in Nazi Germany. And now anti-Semitism, at least in certain circles within the political left, manifests as an attack on Jewish collective liberation, which is Zionism. And so when you actually think about that, when you actually think about the fact that whatever the worst things in the world that we can think of about the Jews, that, in the time of Nazi Germany, it was about power. It was about, who could be held accountable, who could be scapegoated for everything that had happened after the First World War, for the destruction of Germany, and who could be scapegoated for the fact that it was so difficult to rebuild Germany. And it was the Jews. The Jews have always been attacked and scapegoated as whatever the worst ills are in that society. And so today, in the world that we live in today, the worst ills of a society are oppression and genocide and colonialism and white power, white supremacy. And so, as Yossi says, lo and behold, the Jewish state, the Jewish collective, polity is attacked as the worst thing in the world, just as we were as a people, as a religion, as a racial category in generations past. So to go specifically to the question, I certainly do think anti-Zionism is just a modern, politically correct form of anti-Semitism. And what I think is important to say is that in almost every case, an anti-Zionist is someone who may not, an anti-Zionist, again in quotes, is someone who may not actually hate Jews, but someone who has heard someone else who maybe heard someone else who does hate Jews, who is inserting an anti-Semitic narrative into a space where it's not well understood, and it just gets picked up because it makes sense. If you transpose the understanding of white power and white privilege and white supremacy in America onto the Middle East, and if you believe that white people are systematically oppressing people of color in the United States, which I actually do believe to some extent, it's very easy to say, well, Israel is the same thing. Israel is the colonialist white supremacist state that is oppressing the people of color and the Palestinians. So the narrative that people hear makes sense, and they don't realize that it's anti-Semitic. They don't actually realize that in Israel, 60% of Jews are Jews of color who are refugees from the Arab world. They have no concept of what Israel actually looks like. In their minds, Jews are privileged, powerful white people, and Israel is an outpost of privileged, powerful white people oppressing people of color. So they don't actually recognize that being anti-Zionist is denying the Jewish story and Jewish peoplehood and Jewish history. And, the connection, as I said, the inalienable connection between the Jewish people and the state of Israel and Zion. They don't really know what it means. So they don't actually realize what they're saying and doing. Now, anti-Zionism and anti-Israel are almost the same thing, but they're not exactly the same thing. Anti-Zionism is, as I said, is denying the Jewish story and saying that the Jewish people are not entitled to liberation and sovereignty. And anti-Israel is saying, I believe that 192 states in the world should exist, but that Jewish one, that state shouldn't exist. Anti-Zionism, I mean, they often show up in the same way. People say I'm anti-Zionist and therefore I don't want Israel to exist. But I think there's a step between Zionism and Israel. And I think that step is really important because, as I said, Zionist doesn't take positions on Israeli policy because Zionism is our movement for liberation. And the success of the Zionist movement culminated in the manifestation of the Zionist dream in the state of Israel. But Zionism is a progressive movement that I believe in very strongly, no matter what the politics and policies are of the contemporary state. So is it true that people will come up with another way to hate Jews? Absolutely. But right now, this is the real challenge to Jews who are part of organizing for justice in the left. And I think reclaiming our narrative, reclaiming our story, reclaiming our commitment to Zionism, despite any challenges that we may face in terms of our own agreement with the politics and policies of the state of Israel, believing that Zionism is just and moral, that we are entitled to liberation as a people. That's something that I think we should reclaim that, even if it means that we'll face another threat later on.
Amanda, we have one or two more questions before we wrap up. We have one that came in a couple minutes ago that is really timely. Lynn is asking a question that I think has been on a lot of our minds as well, and has been on my mind. How would you respond to people and international organizations claiming that Israel is denying Palestinians COVID vaccines, and further saying that this is yet another example of how Israel is racist?
Yeah, so these questions are really important, and I would there are so many commentary, there's so many commentators who are sharing commentary on this online. I will gladly answer this from my personal perspective, but it is really important for me to make sure to reiterate that Zioness does not talk about these issues because we are about domestic social justice. We are committed to American domestic work. And that's really important because it goes to these litmus tests that that American progressives often face in progressive organizing, where people say, oh, you're a Zionist, are you an apologist for Bibi's regime? What do you think about the settlement policy? What do you think about, the Golan? And, our response to that is it doesn't really matter what we think about those things. And maybe we hate them, maybe we like them. It doesn't really matter. We're here because we want to advance the domestic progressive agenda. And you don't say to a Chinese American woman at the Women's March, what do you think about China's occupation of Tibet or imprisonment of 1 million Uyghurs? I mean, we don't hold people accountable for the wrongdoing, real or perceived, of a foreign government. That's racist. So it really is a critical part of our Zionist work to say, I don't have to have a position on Israel. Maybe I'm just a busy person, an American Jew who's a Zionist and who loves Israel and doesn't know anything about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, it's important for people to have a space where they can say, I'm an American progressive and I'm a Zionist. I believe in Jewish liberation, but I don't have a position on Israeli policy. Or they can say, I have a lot of thoughts on Israeli policy, but I don't owe you an explanation as to what I think about the Israeli government in order to fight for reproductive justice and my bodily integrity as an American woman. So I reject the litmus test entirely, whether I have opinions on it or not. Again, I'm happy to answer the question. I will say a couple of things. First of all, the Oslo Accords are very complicated, and people can look at which governments are actually responsible for allocating health resources to the people in the West Bank within areas A, B, and C. And really the Palestinian Authority has obligations to vaccinate its own people under the Oslo Accords. Now, you could argue Oslo is over, no one has followed Oslo. You could argue, you could find text to support international legal text to support whatever argument you want to make as to who should be responsible for vaccinating the Palestinians. But I think, what's important is to note that throughout the COVID crisis, the Palestinian government was rejecting international humanitarian aid from countries like the UAE because it was sort of boycotting the UAE over the Abraham Accords. Oftentimes, unfortunately, and I don't know exactly what is going on, of course, but in conversations between the Israeli government and the two Palestinian governments, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, when it comes to vaccination. But, unfortunately, it's really not as simple as the world would like it to be. It's also really important to recognize that starting today, Palestinian prisoners who are in Israel are being vaccinated. And the last thing I'll say is I really do hope that Palestinians will be vaccinated soon because I care about, public health for all people. And also anyone who cares about public health for Israelis should care about public health for Palestinians because they're in a pretty small area of land and they will not be safe until everyone is vaccinated. So, who's really responsible for that? People can come to their own conclusions. I certainly think it's reasonable for Israel to vaccinate its own people first, and that is what they have been focused on doing. And of course, they're vaccinating Israeli Arabs, they're vaccinating Druze and Baha'i and everyone in Israel within the territory of the state of Israel. And the other challenges are exactly what they are challenges, but to malign Israel yet again, to call Israel a racist state because it is primarily concerned with vaccinating its own people is really just another form of blood libel, in my opinion.
Thank you for addressing that very complicated issue. I just got one more question in the chat box that I think may be particularly meaningful to some of our teens, our students that are on tonight and their parents. Considering the acceptability of anti-Zionism on many college campuses, how would you advise young students to deal with this issue and the pressures that they may feel from other students?
This is hard. And Zioness has a teen fellowship. So for anyone who's not a senior, please join us for our teen fellowship next year. And we are preparing high school students for college. And what I'll say is it's really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. As the rabbi mentioned in the introduction, I'm an attorney and I did Jewish civil rights litigation before founding Zioness, and a lot of the calls that we got were from kids on college campuses who were facing really rampant discrimination because they wanted to be proud Zionists. And that's not to say that on every campus and in every activist space on campus, you're going to have to deal with that, but it is a real thing that campus is a very ivory tower place. Most American campuses are places where I think we should be valuing diversity of thought and experience, and where people should be able to come and bring their full authentic selves, and the nuances that attach, and where people are able to express their commitments and talk about what makes them who they are. And for me, Zionism certainly is an inherent part of who I am. So for those of you who feel the same way, I encourage you to hold on to that and to find constructive ways to engage it. And Zioness can, give you lots of language, but one thing that I think is really important is to not be afraid to say my Zionism is totally consistent with my progressive values. And no matter what you may think of the Israeli government in any given day, Zionism is not about politics. It's about, the story of the Jewish people. It's a story of overcoming. It's a story of really, creating opportunity out of nothing for a persecuted minority. And to say, as a Jew, I'm committed to justice for all people, and that includes my own people. You will find allies, when you show up that way, when you are confident and courageous in who you are. I don't think people want allies who are afraid to show up for themselves, right? We want to work with people who are strong and confident and, who can talk the walk and walk the talk and, and be part of the movements without compromising a piece of themselves. So if I have any advice, it's to stay strong, find other people who share your values. And if there's a Zioness chapter in the city where you go to school, we're happy to try to connect you with other people. Definitely join our teen fellows. Please join our New York chapter. We have these hard conversations, every single time we meet as a group, as a chapter. And, we will train you how to be involved. Campus is a complicated place, but if you want to be part of justice movements on your campus and you want to be part of clubs, and you want to be a proud Zionist in that work, we can help you navigate those conversations.
And is there, I know you have a wonderful website, zionist.org. Is there information on there about how you can get involved?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just pulling it up. You can, first of all, you can please email me if you want to talk to me directly. It's just amanda@zionist.org. If you go to our website, there is a join us button on the top right. Yes, there's a really important question. There's also, if you scroll down, there's 3 fields for get involved. So first name, zip code, and email, and you can sign up there and someone will reach out to you to get you more involved. The question about, is there a place for young men in Zioness? The answer is absolutely. Zioness is for every gender. It's for every age group. We really welcome everyone. We have 2 out of 5 members of our team are men. 3 out of 10 of our board members are men. I mean, we really, we launched as a reaction to the anti-Semitism in the women's movement, and you all heard our launch story, so you know that, but we are fighting for justice for all people, and this is a welcoming, inclusive space.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for all of the amazing ideas and background and inspiration and encouragement that you've shared with us and our community tonight. Amanda, we want to extend our heartfelt thanks to you, and we look forward to continuing to follow you on your journey. And we're so grateful for your leadership in this regard. And I know at TBS, this is a conversation that we're going to continue in partnership with our Social Action Committee. And we're really grateful for the wealth of information and background that you've given us so that we can, continue to walk this path with really a greater knowledge and greater understanding. The words and ideas that you have shared with us tonight are going to continue to inspire us. And it's my hope for everybody that's on this call that, that you will take to heart everything that Amanda has talked about, and to really remember that we, as Amanda put it so eloquently, we have not only a right, but a responsibility to stand up for causes, to stand up against racism and sexism and homophobia, to really meet the charge that God gave to the Jewish people to do justly and to love mercy and to create a world of equality and opportunity for all. Amanda, thank you so much again for your wonderful presence and your wonderful presentation tonight. And we look forward to hearing more wonderful things about the work that you do with Zionists.
Thank you so much. And I really want to say thank you again to the Social Action Committee, because it's really inspiring for me when synagogues have a social action committee and are committed to doing the justice work. And it is so important to have Jewish representation in these movements. What Zioness is saying is take it a step further. Don't just show up as Jews, but show up as Zionists, and be proud of that, because it is so interwoven and interconnected with our Jewish identities to be Zionists, but people don't necessarily understand that because we don't wear our Zionism proudly. And I promise when you do show up in the world as a Zionist, you will find so many other people who share that, and you will connect with so many other people, and we'll be able to reclaim it, to bring it back as something that we can be really proud of, and not let people tell us that we should be ashamed of it, because we shouldn't.
Amen. Thank you so much again, Amanda. Thank you to our Social Action Committee. Thank you to everybody for participating and listening tonight, and for your thoughtful questions. Just one final note, we are going to have this recording that will be available via our TBS website as soon as we process the recording and get it up there. So definitely, if you'd like to hear this again or share it with everybody, you'll be able to access it. Thank you again, Amanda. Thank you to all of you, and have a good night.